Ladies and gentlemen, this is Tony Arend. I am here at Georgetown University, and I know we have people coming in throughout the entire world, and our special guest presenter coming to us live from Israel. Today, we are going to be having a conversation entitled Towards an International Peace Conference in the Aftermath of the Israel-Hamas War. It is being co-sponsored by the Berkeley Center, the Center for Jewish Civilization, the Department of Government, the Security Studies Program, and the Master of Science in Foreign Service Program. So we have a lot of co-sponsors on this event, and that makes us very, very happy. We are also truly honored to have a dear friend of Georgetown, someone who has taught for many years at Georgetown, Ari Kakowitz. Now, Ari is the Chaim Weissman Chair in the International Relations Department and a full professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He has been at the Hebrew University since 1993. I believe Ari was 5 when he first started in that position. He has been a visiting Israeli professor in the Department of Government numerous times, and in addition to that, has taught with us many, many summers. Ari is the author or co-author or editor of 10 books. The last one was entitled The Unintended Consequences of Peace, Peaceful Borders, and Illicit Transnational Flow, which was published by Cambridge University Press. Today, we're going to be talking about one of the most pressing issues of our time, the Israel-Hamas war. As we know, since October 7th, 2023, this war has ravaged the Middle East, has called into question the foundations of international security, has brought allies together, has separated allies. How do we move forward? What do we do when this war does come to an end? And at some point, the war does come to an end. Ari has put together an amazing presentation on some of his thoughts about how we, as members of the international community, might move forward. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Ari to do a presentation on his views of where we go from here. We will then open it up to questions. I may, as the moderator, pose a few questions, and we also want to get questions from the audience. Now, I would note on your control panel, there is a Q&A portion. I would encourage you to enter your questions as we move forward. I will then read the questions and then pose them to Ari. So Ari, thank you so much for joining us. It's in the evening in Israel, so we really appreciate your taking time to join us. Welcome to Georgetown, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Tony. It's a pleasure being with you. It's 10 p.m. here in Jerusalem, Israel. And I want to start by thanking you and thanking Professor Tom Banchoff, the director of the Berkeley Center, a dear friend, the Department of Government, which is my home in Washington when I visit Washington almost every year in the last 20 years. And it's a pleasure being back at Georgetown, at least in a virtual setting, not under these circumstances. So what I would try to present, share with you in the next 15 minutes or so, it's a policy paper. Actually, this is I think my first policy paper. I have never written a policy paper before. Maybe this is related to the year I had at Georgetown, but about 2 months ago, Mitvim, which is an Israeli think tank dealing with Israeli foreign policies, they asked me, I know them for a long time, to think about writing a paper about an international peace conference in the aftermath of the Israeli-Hamas war. So the policy paper is available, and I would be glad in getting feedback, because this is literally a work in progress. I mean, it's an exercise, it's an intellectual exercise, perhaps in political science fiction, but I think it has a lot of policy relevance. So I move on. So as you mentioned, Professor Arend, the starting point for this tragic war, and I think it's a tragic war for both for us Israelis and Palestinians. October 7th, that was the massacre perpetrated by Hamas, leading to the killing of 1,200 Israelis, most of them civilians, what they call Operation Al-Aqsa Flood. And this was followed by the Israeli reaction as an action of self-defense, the war in the Gaza Strip, that as we know now, the figures, we are talking about maybe 26,000 people. This is according to the Hamas Health Ministry, that might include about 1/3 of them Hamas terrorists, but the numbers are enormous. And the third picture I'm going to show with you, it's completely different, right? And I don't know whether in the audience, those who are watching us, they might recognize that, but this is a completely different picture, right? It has nothing to do with war, it has to do with peace. If we would be in a regular Zoom, I would ask the audience, I guess, Tony, you recognize this picture, right? I'm asking you.
Oh, tell us about it, Ari.
Well, this is the Palacio Real, Madrid. And I'm bringing this picture because as I'm going to talk in the next few minutes, the context is the Madrid Peace Conference for the Middle East from October 1991. So this is the topic, but I want to start with a personal note. I know I'm presenting an academic or a policy paper, but I want to share that with you. As you mentioned, I have been a peace scholar for 31 years, studying international relations and peace. And I can tell you since October 7, all my mind, all my efforts is trying to think how we can exit after the war, because we know that every war has to end, right? And the mood, the national mood in Israel and among the Palestinians is terrible. Trauma, depression, reluctance to talk about the day after. Israel, we are a relatively small country, so everybody here has a relative or somebody who has been kidnapped, and this is the urgent subject, right? I'm carrying this, like many Israelis, bring them home, and relatives, friends. I have even a niece of mine. She survived that party by running to save her life for 4 hours. So just to give a sense of the trauma, and as I mentioned, the trauma for both people. So people are very reluctant here to talk about peace. We are in day 117 into this war. We know that the international community is working about the day after. I was reading the other day a non-paper by the European foreign minister, right, Borrell, regarding a possible international peace conference, right? But we have to take into account that right now there is a lack of political willingness on both the Israeli and Palestinian leaderships to move in that direction, right? So this intellectual exercise is trying to think or ask the question about the possible role that international peace conference might fulfill in drawing a roadmap. And the logic, as I'm going to explain, is a logic of a package deal, in a sense, starting from the end. The idea of an international peace conference is just a tool. It's neither necessary nor sufficient, but it might be a tool that might help to think about the day after, moving from the immediate term of the reconstruction of the Gaza Strip all the way to the peaceful resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? So just very quickly, and for me, it was also a learning experience to learn about the International Peace Conference. International Peace Conference having multilateral diplomatic tools that they can help for peacemaking, end wars, and manage and resolve conflicts, and to peace building, right? Once the war is over, to try to reinforce peace in post-war situations. And historically, we have lots of examples. I found examples since the times of the Renaissance, all the way to our days, right? And Westphalia, the Congress of Vienna, the League of Nations, during the United Nations period, right? So we have plenty of conference as the in regional context. For instance, to try to resolve the Central American wars, we had conferences, Contadora and Esquipulas. And for the purpose of this exercise, I try to devise a typology. So basically, there are three types here. There are very general conferences dealing with peace in general terms, right? Like the Hague conferences or the conference in San Francisco that said the UN. This is less relevant to our conversation. And then there are two other types. Type 2, you have international peace conference that they were convened towards the end of international civil wars, or to negotiate the end of them, right? Since Westphalia, the Vienna Congress, after World War I, Paris, Dayton, 1994, right? And in those conferences, you have negotiations. And then there is a third type, which I think it might be more appropriate with the idea that I want to share, I'm sharing with you, which is type 3, which are more symbolic, ceremonial. They set an agenda for peace. You don't have negotiations in the conference, but they set an agenda for further negotiations, right? For instance, there was a conference in London regarding Yugoslavia, or those conferences that I mentioned in Central America regarding in Contadora and Esquipulas, right? So in a sense, the role international peace conference might help because they might also provide legitimacy for the parties. They might focus attention to the issues at hand. They might bring together all the relevant actors in a multilateral diplomatic setting. So they might be useful. I'm not saying that their record is always wonderful, right? So coming into the Arab-Israeli conflict in general terms, here I mentioned just a few of them, right? And I'm not referring to international peace conference cases where you had, for instance, multilateral negotiations or negotiations with a mediator, like the Rhodes Armistice Agreements of 1949. That's not an international peace conference. Or Camp David 78 or Camp David 2000. I'm referring to larger multilateral settings. In the context of the Arab-Israeli conflict, what we have a Lausanne conference in 1949 that did not work very well. After the Yom Kippur War, and there are many comparisons between this war and the Yom Kippur War, after the War of 1973, there was a conference convened by the UN in Geneva, but Syria and the PLO were not there. I think the model I'm using here is the Madrid Peace Conference of October 1991. There was a conference in 2007 that everybody came. There were about 50 countries. That was the Annapolis Peace Conference that was convened by President Bush. That was only ceremonial. It gave the blessing for the Israeli-Palestinian bilateral negotiation. And there was a conference at Paris in 2017 that the Europeans put together, but they did a very significant mistake. They didn't bring the bride and the groom. I mean, Israelis and Palestinians were not there, which I don't think that's a very good idea. So looking at the record, as I mentioned, the record is mixed. And I think the Madrid conference, although it did not resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict, I think it was very successful in the way that Secretary of State James Baker, in the invitation to that conference, already set the agenda. And that put in motion a process that ultimately would lead to the peace between Israel and Jordan and to the Israeli-Palestinian peace. So what is the rationale and what might be the preconditions for an international peace conference in the aftermath of this war? I think that there is an urgent need to discuss the day after. And I guess that talking to an international audience, this might sound more relevant to you, paradoxically, than here in Israel, right? Because in Israel, in purpose, the current Israeli government does not want to discuss the day after, right? And in a sense, this exercise of those ideas are pushing in that direction. I think that the rationale for an international peace conference is, in a sense, bridging the gap between the immediate concern. The immediate concern now is to try to get to a hostage deal, right? To release the captives, the hostages, and that might end the war. I don't know about that, but there are immediate concerns regarding the reconstruction, demilitarization of the Gaza Strip, right? And in the longer term, you have to deal with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and those issues are pretty much interrelated, right? So the preconditions should be a transition toward a more low-intensity warfare, or perhaps a ceasefire with an hostage deal. I'm not completely sure about that, or a gradual withdrawal of the IDF and replacement by interrogation marks. There are many questions here, right? But it's clear that Israel and the Palestinians, PLO or the PA, should participate. And I think that the International Peace Conference cannot wait for elections either in Israel or in the Palestinian Authority, right? And in a sense, the idea is that this conference might be a tool that might be effective, at least for many of the actors, to enhance their domestic and international legitimacy, and in a sense, also to set kind of strings, right? Committing to their agenda. Okay, so let me turn now to the policy part very quickly, since until now it sounds pretty much like an academic exercise, right? So Mitrim asked me to think, and I'm not reinventing the wheel here, right? About the possibilities regarding policy recommendations. So I want to talk very briefly about the structure and about the substance, okay? I'm asking very pointed question. The first question is a question about when, right? What is the right timing for this conference? In my sense, and I'm thinking even in terms of US domestic politics, right? This has to be convened in the early spring, right? So April, May, and there is an urgency regarding the situation in the ground in the Gaza Strip. Where? So some of the places that I could imagine having this conference, Rhodes, Greece, brings us back to the very successful armistice agreements of 49 that they were negotiated by Ref Bunch. Riyadh would be very attractive, right, for the Israelis because it's part of the package deal. Amman, Jordan, or Cairo, Egypt, those are the two countries that are Israel's neighbors and the most concerned, right, with the dire situation in the Gaza Strip. The next question is who? And I think that's also an interesting question, and we could have an argument about that, because in my assessment, I think this should not be only a regional conference, but rather an international or global conference. So I think the P5 should be there. Then you could say, how about Russia, right? Russia is the spoiler. I don't know. I don't have a clear answer. Now, the quartet members, UN, EU, US, and Russia, and I would make it into a quintet. China should be there, at least rhetorically, China is very much in favor of that. Then the regional quartet should play a very important role, Egypt, Jordan, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia, the Arab League, the countries at the contact group for Gaza, that they are pretty much concerned with the humanitarian situation there, country like Norway, of course, the direct parties, Israel, the PLO, members of the Organization of Islamic Countries. I will not go all the way to invite Iran. I don't know about that. I have my doubts, right? Countries from the BRICS, the EU, ASEAN members, IOs, and part of the reason is because you need all the relevant members of the international community. How this should be a typical type-free international peace conference, not a conference where the parties would negotiate, because that would be very, very difficult, but it could be 4 or 5 days, like Madrid, ceremonial, setting the stage for bilateral and multilateral negotiations, hopefully under Chapter 7 with the mandate of the UN. I'm not sure about that, right? Putting in place perhaps a transitional authority in the Gaza Strip, whether the UN or another international multinational. Now, the second part, I think it's probably more interesting regarding the mandate and the agenda. So the mandate and the legal framework, the mandate has to do with the immediate future of the Gaza Strip, relaunching a political roadmap, and I'm using the term roadmap in purpose, following the original one from 20 years ago. It's nothing new under the sun, in order to fulfill eventually Resolution 181, partition plan, 2 states for 2 peoples. Refresh, revamp the Arab League Peace Initiative and all the relevant United Nations Security Council resolutions, starting from 242 all the way to 250. The agenda, and I would copy what James Baker did, which is to maybe have the agenda in the invitation already, right? So the agenda, and here I think there are several points that they are very important for the discussion. A conditional recognition of the military state of Palestine alongside Israel, establishment of a transitional authority in the Gaza Strip for 2-3 years, whether under UN mandate or in another format. Third, the launching of a massive Middle East Marshall Plan to for the reconstruction of Gaza and link it also to the West Bank, and then peace negotiations in parallel, leading to the 2-state solution and peace between Israel and the Arab countries, first and foremost between Israel and Saudi Arabia. So those ideas are not necessarily new. We hear that right in the speeches by your president, your vice president, your secretary of state. The expected results of this international peace conference would be very similar to Madrid, to put in motion 2 tracks of negotiation, a bilateral one involving Israel and the PLO, Israel and Saudi Arabia, a multilateral one that has to be involved with the immediate reconstruction of Gaza, regional cooperation, as it happened in the 90s at the time of after the Madrid conference, multilateral negotiations between Israel and the members of the Arab League, and perhaps a multilateral track helping the parties regarding issues that they are very complicated, like Jerusalem, refugees, and security arrangements. Finally, to more or less trying to put together all those ideas in my 20 minutes, right? We have to talk about the possible advantages and obstacles, right? Because I can be optimistic, but I cannot be completely naive, right? So you might start by saying, well, there is a significant problem with the current Israeli government, right? Or you can say, in principle, that Israel traditionally, for very good reasons, always prefer a bilateral setting than a multilateral. But if Israel would be invited, as it happened, when was that, 33 years ago, the prime minister would come. Actually, the prime minister at that time was the deputy foreign minister and was in Madrid, Netanyahu. So Shamir came, the Israeli foreign minister didn't come, and Netanyahu, younger, 33 years ago, was there, right? So even Israel would be reluctant to participate. Israel does not have to accept the agenda, it has to be there, right? Now, I think another advantage is this logic of a package deal. What I'm telling here to any friends and students, I don't see any member of the international community coming and investing on or helping in the reconstruction of the Gaza Strip after the war if there is not a clear political horizon. And if there is a clear political horizon, you can bring significant members of the international community. So the conference can draw this phase and structural roadmap, paving the way for transition from ceasefire, de-escalation, stabilization, confidence-building measures, and the eventual fulfillment of a vision of two states for two peoples. And I'm not talking about the Messiah, at the end of the days. I'm talking about a period that should not take more than 5 years. And I think that the conference might help to provide domestic and international legitimacy for many of the actors, right? And just to conclude, the logic here is a kind of hybrid or integrated logic, bringing together immediate issues of humanitarian and logistical assistance with meaningful negotiations toward a demilitarized, and I emphasize the term that now it's clear that that should be the case, a demilitarized state of Palestine and peace between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And I'm not cynical if I end with an Hebrew term that we have in our praise, amen. Thank you. Amen.
Amen.
Let me stop this.
Thank you so much, Ari. Thank you so much for covering so much in 20 minutes. So we really truly appreciate that. I would encourage folks to start putting their questions into the Q&A box. We've got a couple coming up. I want to ask just one immediate question, because obviously one of the things that Ari is hoping would come out of a peace conference would be a recognition of a demilitarized Palestinian state, concretizing the two-state solution. So I've been hearing a lot in the press that the United Kingdom, and I heard today that even the United States is considering, this isn't prejudging that they're going to do it, but is considering a preemptive recognition of a Palestinian state, even in advance of a conference like that. What's your sense on that? Would that be a good idea? Would it be more problematic? Obviously, it's being done as a way of sort of pressuring the Israeli government to reaffirm its commitment to that. What's your sense on that?
Well, I think that's a good question, and I'm trying to find a rational or a clear answer to that, because and I might contradict with what I said in the previous 20 minutes, right? I mean, if you follow, I think in The Economist, they have a month ago an entire article about that, and more or less along the lines of what we are talking. So they were saying, well, this might be left to the end of the process. So in that sense, I would take I'm English school like you are, Anthony. So a middle way, right? So and I think I put that in the policy paper. I would say a conditional recognition of a demilitarized Palestinian state with borders to be determined, right? So a conditional recognition in the sense that it's conditioned upon, Palestinians fulfilling certain. It's very similar to the logic of the roadmap. Now, I think that there is still an advantage in recognizing if the state of Palestine would be recognized. And, it's funny because you might say there is a legal fiction. I mean, right now you have 130 countries and they have embassies, but they are not a real country, right? I mean, they don't fulfill all the conditions. But if you know where you're going, I remember referring to that many years ago in Latin America, since, I deal with Latin America. This would Latin Americanize the Israeli-Palestinian conflict because it would make it into a conflict between two states. So that might facilitate that. That would, of course, you will have a lot of, opposition within Israel, but I think it's not a bad idea. But again, I would not say recognize, because the borders still have to be defined. They might fit more or less, the Clinton parameters of December 2000, the Kerry suggestion, right? But that might probably pave the way, because I think part of the problem with the Oslo peace process, and the Oslo peace process was derailed by the extremists on both sides. It was literally killed, right, by Hamas and by the assassin of Prime Minister Rabin, is that you didn't have a clear political endgame. If you look at carefully at the Oslo, at the Declaration of Principles, at the Cairo agreement, at the second interim agreement, there is no mention of a Palestinian state, literally. So that ambiguity did not help. So this time, if you are more clear, it might.
That makes good sense. One question that was raised by one of our members of the audience connects to, so you and I have both assumed, and it's certainly American foreign policy, that there is a two-state solution. Some have opted to say that there may be a one-state solution. And so we have a questioner who asks if you might talk about sort of the pros and cons of a one-state solution.
Okay. Well, Tony, in the spring, and this looks like prehistory, when I gave the Goldman talk that you missed, right? Because you got I'm sorry. So I was talking about the confederation idea, which is a refined version of a two-state solution. And some people in the audience like it. Some people, they thought that I was dreaming, right? And right now, the two-state solution is very much back in the agenda as a consequence of ripeness, in the most tragic circumstances. What I want to say to answer your question regarding one state, I think the idea of a one-state solution was killed literally on October 7 with the massacre perpetrated by Hamas. And let me explain why. Hamas right now, they published a document last week. They still ask for one-state solution, which is Palestine from the river to the sea. On the Israeli political spectrum, you have extremist parties that they're also asking for the land of Israel from the river to the sea. So you have jihad and you have the Jewish version of that with different tactics, right? So what I'm saying is that the malign version of a one-state solution, which, by the way, I remember conversations with colleagues from George Washington University, like Michael Barnett. They published a book about the one-state reality, right? That you have a one-state reality, Israel ruling that from the river to the sea. That also ended on October 7, because it's clear that Israel cannot manage that conflict. So if it's not the malign version, the Benas version was what I would say Israelstein, La La Land, that Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs can live together under the same political roof. I don't think that's feasible, and I think that that also undermines the legitimate rights of both peoples for self-determination. So what I'm saying is that I'm not saying that the two-state solution will happen tomorrow, but what I suggest is that I think that anybody that thinks about after October 7 about the one-state solution, it's either a fundamentalist or probably somebody that is dreaming about this in less realistic terms than what I'm trying to suggest here, which is coming back to the logic of partition, right? The logic of partition, I think now it's clear that if this conflict has to be resolved peacefully, that's probably the only option, the two-state solution.
Okay, thank you. And I think adding a lot of recent developments and how that affects that is very, very important. A couple of questions about who's involved in a peace conference. And one of our questioners asks about Iran and suggests that for any real regional peace, that Iran has to be involved at this level. What's your sense on that? I know you're a little skeptical, but what's your sense about whether they should be involved and how they could actually be involved?
Well, that's a complicated question. One thing that I learned, and I want to emphasize to you and to the audience, I define myself as a peace scholar, okay? So I learn about Middle East from my colleagues that are Middle Eastern experts, right? So what I know is that I think it was in November, Saudi Arabia brought together the Arab League and the Organization of Islamic Countries, right? And they came with a resolution that I think Iran did not veto, denouncing Israel. You could expect that, etc. But in a sense, referring to the two-state solution, right? So I don't know. I think that inviting Iran, I don't know where that's realistic, but what I think that this framework might pose a significant dilemma for Iran, because right now, and we are focusing on the Israeli-Hamas war, and we know, as you mentioned in the introduction, that this might have a larger ramifications, right? Right now, we have a low intensity. You have a war, but it has not escalated between Israel and Hezbollah. Hezbollah is a Lebanese tentacle, you might say, right? Or proxy of Iran. Your country now, you have to decide what to do, right, regarding Iran. So if we think about Russia as a spoiler, I don't know whether Iran will come to this conference. I don't have a clear answer, but what I know is that putting in motion this political process might pose a significant dilemma to Iran, what to do, right? So so maybe it might be too far-fetched, an idea that many in the audience might say it's already far-fetched to bring in Iran, but it's clear that, as I mentioned, that other relevant members of the Organization of Islamic Countries should be there. For instance, a country that right now we have a terrible rhetoric crisis without breaking diplomatic relations, that's Turkey, right? Turkey, I think, should be there. Qatar, it's a complicated case, right? But it also should be there. I don't know, and that's why I try to beg the question, bring Iran into that conference may be too much.
Okay, that makes sense. And thank you for mentioning Qatar, because I was going to ask a question about Qatar. As you know, I was in Doha a couple of weeks ago. Has Qatar's role so far been a positive role? How would you characterize Qatar's role in the conflict at present?
Well, that's also a complicated question, because I guess, Tony, when you refer to the conflict, you refer to the war right now, right? Because what we know is that Qatar is kind of maverick, right? And probably you followed that a couple of days ago. The prime minister was denouncing Qatar, and he was right. Qatar has pumped finance Hamas, and the leadership, the political leadership of Hamas, they live in Qatar, right? They are what is very tragic, I don't know whether everybody in the audience is aware of that, is that in the last 10 days, Qatar pumped money, $10 million per month, to Hamas, and this was done with the green light and the blessing of the Israeli government, right? So there's a lot of criticism about Qatar. Now, right now, you're right that Qatar, together with Egypt, they're playing a key role regarding the issue of the hostages. And, if you ask me, forget about, talking about the day after and the peace conference. I think, at least this is my personal assessment, right? That's why I'm carrying this all the time. I think that should be the priority, right? That should be the priority for Israel, to release the hostages, and probably the only way to do that is through diplomatic means. And in that sense, Qatar is playing a very important role. It's not that they became a Mother Teresa, right? But they are fulfilling a very important role, because they have, mechanisms of exercising leverage over Hamas, as Egypt does. And I'm aware that, the view from Jerusalem is different from the view from Washington. So for you, Qatar is an important country because it's the largest military base that the US has in the Gulf region, etc., right? So it's more complicated. So it's a question of interest, right? So I would say Qatar is what Thomas Friend used to say, frenemy, something like that, right? But regarding the immediate issue, which should be the priority of trying to release the 136 hostages, and we don't know how many. We know that about 30 of them, they are already dead, right? Qatar plays a key role.
Thank you. We've had several questions raised about the status of Jerusalem. And so I want to get into your views on some ideas as to how Jerusalem might be addressed. But I have one preliminary question, which was asked by one of our audience members. And I find that fascinating, especially given that the Berkeley Center is hosting this. And that is, do you think interreligious diplomacy should be a part of the International Peace Conference, especially in light of the need to address the concerns about Jerusalem? So that, I guess that would be the first question is, do you envision interreligious diplomacy playing a role in the actual peace conference? And then I'd love to hear what you think some plausible solutions might be for the status of Jerusalem.
Okay. So the first question, religious diplomacy, and I know I have to be careful what I say since the Berkeley Center is hosting us, right? I mean, the Pope would play a positive role. You know, this situation, although it's very, very different, reminds me a bit, you know, the Colombian Civil War ended in 2016, partly because everybody in the international community was pushing in that direction, including the Pope, okay? So the Pope could play a role. I can tell you, and you know, I would say that I was a bit disappointed in the sense that it's clear the Pope came very strongly condemning the Hamas massacre on October 7th, but then, like other, you know, Latin American leaders, like the president of Brazil, was using kind of discourse like blaming Israel of using terrorism in the Gaza Strip, right? So but I think the Pope and other religious leaders could play a positive role because, especially under the circumstances that right now, we see on the ground fundamentalists, right? We see Islamic fundamentalism in the worst possible case, would say Hamas behave like ISIS, if not worse, right? And Sunday evening in Jerusalem, unfortunately, we have a show of our Jewish fundamentalists that maybe it will be only a show, right? That also is not helping in moving in a political direction. So maybe we have to hear the voice of the Pope and religious leaders, you know, Muslim leaders and Jewish leaders in that direction. Now, Jerusalem, which I think, I mean, it's perhaps a difficult question, but I feel more at ease referring to that. As I mentioned, we don't have to reinvent the wheel, right? And you know, I have chosen the city of Jerusalem. That's the place where I live since '79 out of choice. I confess I'm a Zionist in the good sense. I moved here to Jerusalem. That's Hebrew University, right? The best university in Israel. But Jerusalem is 1 million people, and you have religious issues. We are very close to God, but it's mundane issues. 1 million people, right? About 35% of them are Palestinians, 60 or so percent, 65 we are Jews, right? It's complicated. Now, the key, I would say, to resolve the issue of Jerusalem would be what President Clinton in his parameters was referring, and I think Secretary Kerry was reiterating. You don't have to divide again the city. I mean, the city was divided between 49 and 67. In 67, Israel, in a sense, occupied and annexed, right, East Jerusalem. So the cities together. But nobody, I think even the US moved the capital, the embassy to Jerusalem. That doesn't recognize Jerusalem as our capital. So the logic is very clear. What President Clinton said, what is Jewish should be Israeli, what is Arab should be part of the future Palestinian state. Okay, and President Clinton, I'm sharing this with you or the audience, it might sound surrealistic, regarding the Temple Mountain, which is the most difficult issue. He was suggesting to offer the Palestinians the ground where you have the two mosques. The two mosques are the third holiest place for Islam, right? And the underground to the Jews, because that's where the temple was. Now, what I can tell you, Tony, and everybody else, and I learned this from one of my teachers, Professor Mati Steinberg, he said the Palestinians would never come to a deal or they would never accept the state unless they have sovereignty over the Temple Mount. Now, if the Palestinians have sovereignty over the Temple Mount, we Israeli Jews, we have the Western Wall. So part of the idea, you take even the old city and you can divide, and there are plans for that, the Geneva plans, there are many plans already in place. So you have the Jewish quarter, the Armenian quarter for Israelis, and the Arab quarter, the Muslim quarter, and the Christian quarter for the Palestinians, right? So you could, in principle, make Jerusalem the capital of the two states, right? Not like President Trump that in January 2020 was allocating 10% of Jerusalem beyond what we have here, which is a wall separating parts of the city. That would be a non-starter, right? So I think, paradoxically, I would say, and I'm explaining this as this is easygoing, right? Very easy issue. It's complicated because this is a sacred place for all the Abrahamic religions, but I think there are plans in place, right? Including, ideas I was telling my students 2 days ago that the late King Hussein suggested. I learned this from a colleague, Professor Ruth Lapidot, give sovereignty to God. That's also an interesting idea. If you give sovereignty to God, then are functional issues that you have to resolve, right? So I think in that sense, Jerusalem is more tractable. I mean, it's easier than the other big issue that has to be addressed, which is the issue regarding the right of return or the refugee issue, right? Because Jerusalem, and I invite all the people in the audience to come and visit our city, is that it's kind of segregated. I mean, you can find a way, right, that as Clinton was suggesting, and from what I know, even the Palestinians agree that most of what we call the neighborhoods built after 67 would stay under Israel sovereignty, except for the one built in the late 90s called Al-Homa, right? So it might sound very easy to put in practice. I know it's not, but I think that there are blueprints, right, to come to a solution regarding Jerusalem.
Well, that makes sense. And having visited Jerusalem, it's an amazing place to visit. You get a tremendous sense of the holy there, and you also get a sense of how many different peoples there are and how diverse a place it is.
I think we have more churches in Jerusalem than in Rome.
That may be true, but we might have to ask the Pope that one, and so I don't know. So I have another question. Now, this comes from my classmate, Rabbi Charles Arian, and he asks about sort of Netanyahu. So it's a very, very specific Bibi question. He says, would Netanyahu agree to participate in this conference? Is that a non-starter? Could it bring down the government? But maybe in so doing, it could lead to a more centrist government. So maybe any ideas about whether Netanyahu would even deign to agree to this, or whether that would lead to some kind of internal transformation in Israel?
Well, you ask, you answer, Tony. I mean, in the question, you have embedded already the answer, right? Because I have no idea. It's clear that right now, and this is very sad, and I would say even tragic, that Netanyahu is playing not as a statesman, but as a petty politician, right? So he's already in a political campaign, right? And that's why he's, in a sense, he's kind of disgraceful. I mean, he's rejecting any conversation about the day after. Now, if you have this conference in place, I think that Netanyahu will have to come. He might not agree with most of the points in the agenda, But even if that conference would trigger a political crisis or lead to the downfall of the government, let be it. Because, as I mentioned, those ideas of international peace conference might create unintended consequence, which is a term that I like, right? I mean, when you think about that, in 77, I didn't mention that, President Carter wanted to reconvene the Geneva Conference. And President Sadat did not like that at all, and that was what, because he didn't want the Soviets to be back. So that was one of the motivations to engage in this historical visit, peace negotiations with Israel. So what I'm saying, that might happen, that might be a trigger, right? Because if we go back in history, you know, after Madrid, what you had initial negotiations between Israel and Jordan. With the Palestinians, it was clear that eventually the conversations have to be with the PLO, but that also triggered a crisis between the US government regarding loan guarantees and the Shamir government. And then you had elections, and late Rabin was elected, right? So according to the polls, if you look at the polls from 2 days ago, the centrist party, the Mahanea Mamlahti, with this former General Gantz, is taking 37 seats out of 120. And the Likud is dropping from 32 to 16, right? And most of the Israelis, I mentioned at the beginning, or maybe I didn't mention, the ideas I'm reflecting or I'm sharing with you are my ideas. They don't reflect EBRU, the Department of IR, and don't take me as the average Israeli citizen, okay? But I can tell you that right now, there seems to be a consensus by the majority of Israelis, for many different reasons. We don't want Netanyahu to continue being the prime minister. That's it. You might even say that his reluctance to engage in any political discussion is jeopardizing you could say, the military actions. And even the army is begging the government. The army is not the organ, right? The state organ that has to decide the day after. So it seems that Netanyahu and many others forgot about Clausewitz, right? War is the continuation of politics by other means, right? So in that sense, an international peace conference, even as a quote unquote provocation, might trigger or might contribute to the delegitimation, which is already under zero, of Netanyahu. To the same extent, I would add, and I didn't talk about that, we didn't talk about that at all. I think an international peace conference can also help the Palestinian side, right, in putting strings, because one of the concerns, and we didn't talk about that at all, is that there are talks on the Palestinian side of bringing Hamas after the war as part of the PLO. And if Hamas keeps its fundamentalist genocidal ideology, that's a non-starter. And having a clear agenda, as it's suggested in the International Peace Conference, might help in that sense in strengthening the Palestinian legitimacy in the direction of peace. And if Netanyahu would continue saying no, I guess more and more Israelis would come to the conclusion that it's time to have early elections and change the government. And the carrot, the strong carrot here, which I think is not my idea, it's clearly in the agenda of the US foreign policy, is to continue with the normalization with Saudi Arabia. But this time Saudi Arabia will not be satisfied with, just a discourse. Or Saudi Arabia right now, I think everybody would only be satisfied if there is a clear path towards a Palestinian state.
And that was actually one of the questions about the connection of Saudi Arabia. So I want to ask you what I think is going to be the final question, because I'm going to give you a couple minutes to sum up. We got about 6 minutes left. But if you were to give advice to Secretary of State Blinken or President Biden, given your desire to get a peace conference and to move forward in the, if you will, the day after the conflict, what would you tell them? What would you tell President Biden or Secretary of State Blinken to sort of motivate them in this area?
I would tell them, it's a kind of, I feel a chutzpah, right? Playing that role play, go for it because, and this is an issue that I'm not an expert, but one thing that I think we might agree, Tony, as you know, all professors of international relations, as Kissinger used to say, it's all about domestic politics. I think that it's not just an interest for Israelis and Palestinians. I think it's an interest for the US. You are into an election year, right? And President Biden, what President Biden did to the Israelis, you cannot imagine. We were moved. We literally cried. We were really moved when he came. What was that? 2 or 3 days after the massacre, and he came and he brought the carriers groups, etc. So he put his political, I would say, future or being reelected at stake. So I think this is urgent also in terms of domestic politics, and this is, I think, this is the case, as I mentioned before, that I think the US should express tough love, right? And I'm not saying that the International Peace Conference is the only avenue. I'm talking about those issues. I say it's not that I invested in an International Peace Conference. I think it's a tool, right? And I know that the US and many other countries are playing with different mechanisms. But I think that, it's time to move and be probably more explicit. I think, it's part maybe of your political culture. You're too polite, right? To be tough on this, right? Because it's like most of the international community, and I can share with you in the last minute. I don't know whether this was a reliable poll. There was a poll a few days ago that gave us hope here in Israel that 51% of the Israelis might agree to see maybe a US-led transition period and a peace with Saudi Arabia and a demilitarized Palestinian state. I don't know where that's necessarily the case, right? But this is the case where probably the only component that it's in place to move in the direction of this process, it's the involvement of the international community, because there is no leadership that wants that or has the legitimacy, there is no much trust. So in a sense, you have to put this in motion and then allow us, Israelis and Palestinians, to come together.
Well, that actually seems like an appropriate way to end. We have technically 2 minutes on the clock. Ari, I'm going to give you the last word. Any final thoughts, anything you want to say to our great audience here? We want to thank our audience for all their amazing questions. Obviously, we weren't able to get to all the questions, but we want to thank you for the questions. We want to big shout out to University Vice President Tom Banshoff for sponsoring this, and to the Berkeley Center and our co-sponsors. But Ari, you got the last word.
Well, I want to say thank you. I want to say thank you for allowing me to share those ideas. And as I mentioned, I'm not necessarily reflecting the majority of Israelis, but we are many Israelis that were thinking about that, because I think that with what William Zartman, we are now in a mutually hurting stalemate, a moment of ripeness. This conflict cannot be managed. So the only way out is a political process. And to do that, we need, as the Beatles say, we need some help from our friends. Thank you.
Thank you, my friend. And thanks to everybody for attending. And we wish everyone peace. Shalom.